morning. It's Onrash. I will be speaking about two topics which are on the first side not that much related, but as we will see, they are quite close to each other, and it's the topic of mobility and participation. I will be using English, and it's a European English, so don't be startled. If there's questions, then come up with the questions later, please. And since we are a bit behind schedule, let's just dive into it. Or not. All right, so first things first, who am I and why am I here? As I said, my name is Onrash, and to use a bit of a story, I can be seen as a captain of a flagship youth explorer. I'm a researcher and I'm a freelancer, which is also why I don't wear a tie. That's my right as a freelancer. What I do is that I support evidence-based approach. What I look into is young people and how young people are working in different spheres of life. And what I'm trying to do is to conduct research, evaluation, and share information and provide consultancy in order to well, I know the mobility of people over 2,000 years. Roman roads, 2,000 years back. So what I'm trying to show in here is that all throughout the history, the mobility, the topic of people moving, what I will try to do now, and I will try to be rather swift about it because we're a bit behind schedule, is to start in Europe, which is a place which I know rather well, and then move to some other parts of the world. And I will just take you on a tour with me to see where the participation and mobility of young people is and how. Let's start in Europe. And let's start with a bit of history. Council of Europe, you might have heard about them. They have been dealing with the topic of youth mobility from the 1960s. And as you can see, they have actually started with topics just like traveling with collective passports or au pair placements, and more and more structured into which supports. Let's move on to European Union. Again, you might have heard about them. They have gone about the youth mobilities in a quite structured way. So ever since the 1988, they started something they call youth mobility programs, which means that they support cross-border mobilities of young people. And of course, there are some other international organizations, just as the UN, UNICEF, OECD, International Labour Organization. Each of these also support mobilities of young people, just as yourselves, to some extent, but usually with a specific topic, just like in case of the International Labour Organization, it would be employment, for instance. Now, when I talk about mobility, direct participation mechanisms, we'll be speaking about those later. One shot, repeated, national, international, long-term on EU issues, Europeans, and not as Czechs or Slovaks or Poles, but really as Europeans, and it helps them to then be more, let's say, engaged in the EU issues, see what it's like over there. When it comes to volunteering as a specific type of mobility, but a very, I would say, a very influential one, it leads to direct involvement of citizens in local development and fostering of civil society and democracy. Of course, when you go and volunteer abroad, then when you come back, you're not only taking back all the experience that you have had, but you're also taking back the willingness to do the same in your home country, in your local town, in your local community. Last research I have quoted is the participants in the program Youth in Action, that's one of the programs funded by the European Union, have a significantly higher voting record in European elections than their peers. And this is, again, something we have heard about the elections, about voting in the previous speeches. This is something that can be seen as a very direct and clear impact of a mobility of young people. They just simply go vote more frequently than their peers who don't go abroad. I have also contributed to, I have also contributed to research which explored this topic further. First of them is something we call Ray LTE. I'm part of a research network which is directly looking into the mobilities of young people and what are the impacts of young people, of the mobilities on young people on different areas of their lives. In this particular research, we have figured out that we have explored that that there was an increase in skills and knowledge, and we have also seen that people who go abroad are actually people who already have quite developed values and attitude with respect to the democratic processes. In other words, young people who go abroad are already rather well off in terms of how they feel about democracy, how they feel about being active and willingness to be active. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. It can be generalized, and I'm not saying it's always the case, but it's very likely the case that all of you, as you're sitting in here, would be rather or slightly, at least slightly more active than your friends at home, who just simply would not go for an exchange like this. Another example, which is not really about, which is partially about research and partially about participation structure, is something called a structured dialogue process. In the European Union, one of the activities between the EU bodies and the young people in the member states is the structured dialogue. It's now called the youth dialogue. And the structured dialogue is basically a process of consultations on different topics between the EU bodies and the people in the member states. And then the consultation results are taken back to the bodies, and the bodies should take them into account when they are actually taking their decisions. What happened in the 2018 run was that there was a really nice process of formulating, of young people coming together, representatives of young people coming together, forming questions, then going back to the national states. There was a consultation which overall reached to almost 50,000 young people, and then they brought all of these opinions back up, and they created something that is called youth goals. And all of these youth goals are now part of the European Youth Strategy, which is forming the next European youth policy up until the 2027, which I would say is quite an achievement. And so let's just sum it up quickly. So what impacts has mobility had on youth participation in Europe? First, it's increasing civic participation. It's sharing and cementing democratic values. It's creating spaces for this sharing and for the democracy to develop further. And one more question would be, why is that even important? Or why is it important now, if it is important? I will go back to my home country. I could be, pointing fingers at Trump and at the UK, at Poles, at Hungary, and all the different governments, but I will just go back home because I don't need to really go very far. There has been a study conducted by my colleagues in 2019, and you might know that in 1989, we have finally found our sovereignty as a democratic state, which means that it's 30 years now since we have just been a democratic state, and we have been able to really decide our message as the people. And there has been a study which was looking into different angles of life in the Czech Republic. It's called Divided by Freedom, because it actually found out that only just about half of the Czech population believes that the democracy is the best governance model. Almost a quarter thinks that authoritarian models are well suited to some particular occasions, and 1/5 of, I would say these results are rather alarming for a democracy, for the people who have really fought hard to actually gain their democracy. There is an interesting piece of the puzzle. They have also looked into what are the subgroups in the population, and they have been able to identify a group of people. Emerging cosmopolitan class was least critical towards the management of digitalized and globalized learning environments. In other words, these were the people who have actually benefited from the mobilities themselves. And then they are able to actually use all of these skills and attitudes in their own political views. We've been in Europe long enough. Let's just move on. You might know that there's some traditional and then there's some, let's say, innovative or, well, let's call them innovative forms of participation. This is actually a research by a friend and colleague of mine, Dan Moxon, who has cooperated with Anne Crowley from the UK. It's a book, you can download it online, there's a link for that. What they actually provided is an outline of the conventional, unconventional, and innovative forms of participation. I will go through it briefly just so that we can link it to the mobility I have talked about previously. Conventional participation is everything that you imagine when somebody says political participation. So it's voting, it's membership in political parties, and basically using all the formal mechanisms there are to take part in the decision making. Unconventional participation are things like signing petitions, participating in demonstrations, boycotting, meaning buying only really just the products that I want, and not products which are, for instance, ethically not sound. So these are the two, let's say, basic distinctions, but then goes further and actually looks into what are the innovative, more and less innovative forms of youth participation. Let's go through these because they are quite interesting. So the less innovative forms of youth participation, in particular, youth councils. You might have heard about those. There's quite a few, I would say, even representatives present in here. It's basically young people forming bodies which then represent young people in certain areas. Youth activism and protest. Again, we have mentioned that before. It's the young people just simply coming together and really going for that one cause, just trying to push through any decision they believe should be in their interest. And then there's more innovative forms of youth participation. These are co-management and co-production. Co-management and co-production is basically adults and young people coming together and forming a body which shares power. And this is an important moment, the power sharing, because then the young people have exactly the same vote as the adults and can really co-manage and co-produce any result there is. A nice example of that would be the Council of Europe's Council of Youth, where the young people actually attend sessions and take votes with the same weight as their adult colleagues. Then there is a deliberative youth participation. Deliberative youth participation is basically a public consultation and the structured dialogue cycle I have mentioned previously, where there is a question formed and then young people are actually asked about what they think about all the different matters, and then it's taken back up. That would be a good example of deliberative youth participation. So it's intentional, involving young people in the political decisions on different levels. And then, of course, we've got the digital participation. I have seen lots of you having your cell phones on you. I can imagine all the different apps that you are, well, I can't imagine all the different apps that you are using. So that's basically a tool which can go cross-sectionally across all of these previous tools I have mentioned. Now, I'm using, or well, Dan is using the less and more innovative forms. They have actually conducted a study which labeled some of those as less innovative and some of those as more innovative, based basically on how spread they are and what is the impact the young people can really have. And then they asked a really interesting question. Are actually the more innovative forms having more influence at the decisions or not really? And they figure out that it's not the case. So what does it mean then? Are the more innovative forms worse then? No. They are just simply widening the range of possibilities for the young people to participate. It's not necessarily true that any new form of participation is better than the forms which are already there. It's just widening the range. And let's get to conclusions. Creating youth participation opportunities, and that's what we spoke about now, all these models of youth participation, that's really important. But youth participation opportunities always need to be matched in level of the skill set. If you have young people who are actually not aware of the opportunities or are not really able to participate, then you can have all the opportunities you want, and the participation will not happen anyways. Providing youth mobility opportunities based on non-formal and informal learning is important in order to bring young people to the necessary levels of these skill sets. It's basically like a structure, like two structures which are really supportive of each other. What I have actually shown during this presentation is young people going abroad are developing a certain, they are also bringing back certain attitudes, and these being there.
A state institution in Germany to promote citizenship education, invited to a conference in this very small town called Beutelsbach in the years 1976. However, the principles summarized in the Beutelsbach consensus were not adopted at the conference, but distilled by Hans-Georg Wehling for conference documentation from the talks and the discussions of the event. The results were not a substantive agreement on objectives and concepts of citizenship education, but the consensual formulation of three basic principles for citizenship education. With the Beutelsbach consensus, a bridge was built that led to the overcoming of polarization within citizenship education. The Beutelsbach consensus, a minimal consensus, comprises three principles. First principle, prohibition against overwhelming the pupil or the students. You students think about whether your teachers are perhaps unconsciously manipulate you with their positions. It is not permissible to catch pupils unprepared or unawares, but whatever means for the sake of imparting desirable opinions and hindering them from forming an independent judgment. It is precisely at this point that the dividing line runs between citizenship education and indoctrination. Indoctrination is incompatible with the role of a teacher in a democratic society and the universally accepted objective of making pupils capable of independent judgment. Second principle, treating controversial subjects as controversial. Subjects which are controversial in intellectual and political affairs must also be taught as controversial in education instruction. This demand is very closely linked with the first principle, for if differing points of view are lost sight of, options suppressed and alternatives remain undiscussed. The path to indoctrination is being trodden. We have to ask whether teachers have, in fact, a corrective role to play. That is, whether they should or should not specially set out such points of view and alternatives which are foreign to the social and political origins of pupils and other participants in programs of citizenship education. In affirming this second fundamental principle, it becomes clear why the personal standpoint of teachers, the intellectual and theoretical views they represent, and their political opinions are relatively uninteresting. Third principle, giving weight to the personal interests of pupils. This is the official translation. Better, I say, becoming aware of what interests and what own interests and being able to commit to it and participate. Pupils must be put in a position to analyze a political situation and to assess how their interests are affected, as well as to seek means and ways to influence the, quote, 3 arid points, which one could almost call commonplaces, end of quote. The Bertelsbach consensus has quickly found the acceptance of all educators in citizenship education, whether in universities, schools, or also in non-formal citizenship education. The minimal consensus not only provides normative basic rules for the practice of citizenship education, it also protects it in schools and on behalf of the public from questionable political guidelines or one-sided expectations of the diverse interest groups. But the Bertelsbach consensus has also been subject of lively discussions in Germany and all over the world. Not necessarily named Bertelsbach consensus since the publication of the conference documentation. It seems to be important to stress that consensus is not the same as harmony. It almost inspires the culture of conflict. Without a minimal consensus, there's no constructive conflict, no constructive debate. On the one hand, it was pointed out that the consensus, if it did not already exist, had to be invented. On the other hand, it was criticized again and again, and sometimes even questioned as a, quote, idiot machine, end of quote. A recurring point of criticism is that the other side of the controversy requirement is a requirement of neutrality, which contributes to the depolarization of citizenship education because real power and power relations are not sufficiently taken into account. However, these misinterpretations for such an idea found neither in Wieling's formulation of the Bertelsbach results nor in the subsequent political didactic discussion, thus it does not follow from the controversial presentation of the teaching contents that the teacher has no own positions and is not allowed to point them out. He is hopefully a zone politikon as defined by Aristoteles. This statement is relevant in 2 aspects. Firstly, for controversial teaching situations in a democracy, and second, for teaching situations that transcend these boundaries of democracy. In the first case, the challenge for the teacher is to bring his position into the classroom in a non-overwhelming way. A fine line, because teachers are always perceived as a positive or negative role models whose convictions can actually be internalized or even taken over from opportunism. A teaching reflected on this, however, enables a constructive, as Peter Henkenburg formulates, culture of dissent, which allowed the learners in a not overwhelming learning situation to get to know controversial positions, to discover their own interests, and to be shown possibilities to act according to these interests. In the second case, it becomes clear that there's not only no requirement of neutrality, but also a limit to the element of controversy. If the central basic principles of democratic constitution, human dignity, the principle of democracy, and the rule of law are questioned or even violated, it is almost the duty of the teacher not to take a neutral position and instead to defend these basic principles and openly stand up for them. If we had no basis at all to dispute, then there would only be total antagonism, which would not permit democratic coexistence. It is quite clear the Bertelsbach consensus wants and promotes political debate. Citizenship education has found its minimal consensus in these 3 principles. Representatives of school pedagogy and empirical educational research sometimes critical note that with these 3 principles of the Bertelsbach consensus, it repeatedly tends to invalidate or even stop any time-oriented modernization. Such questions are, for example, the following. What answer does citizenship education find to the eternal controversy in schools about how to organize learning efficiently on the one hand, based on science, but on the other side, to enable the promotion of competence through experience and activity? Isn't the school here permanently in a conflict with itself? And above all, by linking this conflict particularly, preferably with the overpowering prohibition of the Bodelsbach consensus, it creates the problem of wanting to establish projects and experiential learning on the one hand, while at the same time fearing the associated commitment, which also means taking a position in the political process in democracy, of restricting the inner core of excellent project didactics. For example, to change this reality positively and pro-democratically in learning about realistic challenge. We have this discussion in Germany. Reinhold Hetke therefore provocatively formulates the title of an essay, "Participation is the problem, not the solution." Nevertheless, it should be noted that the third principle, read correctly, does not per se exclude voluntary political action by pupils. Second example, where are the answers of citizenship education regarding to the equivalence of all citizens in a democracy? One man, one vote. This critical question applies above all in one regard citizenship education and democracy as complex forms, which is true that can only be mastered, enlightened, and committed to progress if those affected and at the same time involved has corresponding education and corresponding reflected knowledge. But in the end, I also want to find friendly tones. In my opinion, treating controversial subjects as controversial has the most significant practically benefit for citizenship education. It makes it clear to every teacher that citizenship education cannot be about proclaiming doctrines or opinions. The controversy is inevitable when it comes to forming young people's view. Teachers must therefore make a great effort to identify the crucial debates on the various political issues dealt with in the class and to present them in such a way that pupils can understand them. If a strong point of view is ignored for whatever reason, it is manipulative and prevents an independent judgment. In times at which increasingly personalized offers on the internet and social media lead to existing opinion preference being strengths and majority opinions being appropriated. In times when digital platforms strongly influence the formation of judgment, for example, by using algorithms to control news or manipulate valuation decisions, a citizenship education is required beyond media education, which on the one hand makes controversies, marginalized positions or exclusions from discussion visible in the representations of political views, and on the other side promotes processes of opinion formation or judgment based on political facts. But the core area of the democratic order must never be abandoned. It must not be discussed and included in the controversial area. To sum up the Bodelsbach consensus with its three principles, here again, prohibition against overwhelming the pupil, treating controversial subjects as controversial, and giving way to the personal interests of pupils is a minimal consensus that has never been questioned in principle to this day, but has triggered discussions. The three principles will continue to serve as a whetstone for citizenship education to discuss current developments again and again in the light of the consensus. Siegfried Schiele is to be agreed if he regrets that the effect of the Bodelsbach consensus remains limited above all because in our society, at least in Germany, the value of citizenship education is still not recognized. Thank you very much for taking your time to listen to my presentation.
네, 좋은 말씀해 주신 글로이 교수님 감사드리고요. 청소년은 합리적인 시민의식 교육 지침인 보일티스 바흐의 의미와 3대 원칙, 그리고 지도자의 중요성, 중립성에 대해서 확인할 수 있는 좋은 시간이었습니다. 시간 관계상 바로 토론을 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 이후 토론 순서는 한국청소년정책연구원 김현철 박사님께서 맡아주실 예정입니다. 토론에 참여하실 우리 토론자분들은 지금 무대로 올라오셔서 자리가 준비되는 대로 착석해 주시기 바랍니다. 토론자는 성남시 차세대위원회 조영은 위원장님과 김범진 총무님, 그리고 성남시 청소년 행복의회조 김대희 의장님 참여해 주시고요. 그다음 독일 U18의 안네백 펠트님 참여해 주실 예정입니다. 아울러서 컨스탄티노스 필리피디스, 그래서 플로리나 청소년 활동 연합 대표님께서 함께 참여를 해 주실 예정입니다. 아울러서 여러분들의 빠른 점심 식사 제공을 위해서 쉬는 시간은 별도로 갖지 않고 계속 이어서 진행을 할 생각입니다. 혹시라도 화장실이 급하시거나 개인 용부가 있으신 분께서는 조용히 뒷문을 이용해서 활용해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. 별도로 쉬는 시간 없이 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다.
다양한 형식의 청소년 참여가 가능하다는 걸 생각하게 됐습니다. 자, 곧바로 이제 세 분 토론을 듣도록 하겠는데요. 원래 예정이 되어 있습니다만 아시는 것처럼 상황을 잘 이해하시리라 믿습니다. 그래서
And this Fourth Happiness Council expected to suggest 10 points of Teenager Labor Rights Ordinance, and the City Council actually enacted this ordinance. Second, in 2018, Third Happiness Council suggested revising Resident Participatory Budgeting Ordinance to be able to participate youth in participatory budgeting. Third, in 2019, Fourth Happiness Council suggested a solution about better commuting conditions in front of Hyoseong High School, and the city accepted that suggestion and improved the conditions and made more bus routes. Our Fourth Happiness Council has 7 task force teams to proceed our each policy. Smoking booth team has planned to increase installation of smoking booth on bus stations or other places to protect smokers' rights and pedestrians' health. Minority group has planned to increase installation of smoking booth. Minority group team has prepared policies which can help many disadvantaged people. School bus safety team has suggested a policy to promote school bus safety system. Legal support center team has prepared policies about installing a legal support center for youth. And then, youth welfare team has made an ordinance that supports transportation costs to commute to school or job for vulnerable social group people in 20 to 24 ages. Teenage welfare team found a way to guarantee and promote out-of-school children's rights, so the team has planned to push forward extending a range of application on students' rights ordinance to out-of-school children. Teens Cultural Card team has suggested an idea that supports cultural activities for out-of-school children in form of a local debit card. Until now, I introduced our organizational structure and proceeding policies. This time, I will share our experiences and activities. In May, we participated in Korea Policy Suggestion Conference for Youth and suggested extension of teens' rights in participatory budgeting to a government department. Also, to discuss about this suggestion and we will decide our 10 policies and ordinances whether policies are appropriate.
From 2005 to 2014, we didn't go on for a while. When the Songnam Happiness Council was established, but it in 2019. We are actually a group that started all over again. Therefore, we have to decide the direction of this
young people who were frustrated about the election system in Germany. They were fed up, so they just started their own election. And without any campaign, without any advertised, determined and volunteer political action of young people in their free time. And the size of it has now grown to a point where they start to reach a point of political power through that project, which is a crucial moment in that project. And I will talk about that a little bit more tomorrow. Society today. So if they want to take part in political activities, why should they not? Especially if we talk about democracies, right? There's the second point, which is political education, if it's well done, might have the result that young people open their mouth. So we should be confident to go for the topics that you like and that you're interested in, and don't feel pressured to talk about pensions if you don't care. So that's it for now, and I hope I get an opportunity to talk to you later tomorrow. Thank you.
네, 아주 짧은 시간에 짜릿하게 청소년들 너무 과소평가하지 말고 어른들 너무 과대평가하지 말라. 그렇죠. 쟁취하라 이런 말씀 되게 인상적입니다. 예, 다음은 그 그리스에서 오신 청소년활동연합 대표이신 콘스탄티노스 필리피디스.
Yes. Yes, it's absolutely right. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation, participating in this interesting conference. I'm really happy that I'm among young people and panelists and speakers with experience in youth policy, and of course people that influence the new generation actively. Participating in the dialogue of the future youth policy, and of course be active in the local societies. This is also the initial of our organization, Florina, which I had the presentation, but because of the limited time, I will not do the presentation today, probably tomorrow. But the initial of our organization was exactly that, to involve youngsters, youth, with youngsters. But in locally with this organization, we can go further and we can better. Concluding this, because there is no more time, I would like to say to be equipped in order to face all the difficulties that will come from from the revolution that's happening every day in our life. And this will lead us to peaceful world, democratic world, a world that will...
네. 예, 정말 짧은 시간이지만 그 어느 분도 좋습니다. 질문 드립니다. 보이텔스바 말씀하시면서도 논쟁적인 것은 논쟁적으로 해야 된다는 말씀을 하셨는데 꼭 그렇게 중립적으로 해야 될까요? 왜냐하면 정치적인 어떤 논쟁, 늘 일상적으로 정치적으로 논쟁을 해야 된다고 한다면 오히려 더 오픈된 어떤 토론의 장들이 열려야 되지 않을까? 아이들도 더 어린 나이에서부터 어떻게 생각하십니까? 네.
We are working in Germany. We are working in a system of different political parties, which are going from the left to the alt-right, and we have public funding for different youth activities. So there is constitutional and there's like by law the obligation to stay neutral towards the parties. I mean, it's not even an obligation. There's like it's called Gebot in German, so it's like a stipulation that you should not favor one political party over another. And all of you are more or less familiar that Germany has like a quite dark history, so we have those laws in place for a reason. So we cannot use political education to indoctrine young people from very young age into a certain direction. There's You have to be careful though with the word of neutrality, because being neutral towards parties doesn't mean that you have.
I have actually basically the same experience from the Czech Republic. We also have a law which prohibits to favor parties up until age. And from what I know, there also was, we have an initiative which is called One World in Schools, and part of that initiative is also what we call a high school voting, high school elections. And that's basically that the high school students come together and they have their elections. I mean, most of them are.
현장에서 말하지 않는 게 중립적인 것은 아닐 테고, 그래서 정치적으로 중립적으로 우리가 어떻게 가르쳐야 되느냐라는 문제는 되게 시민 교육을 할 때 되게 중요한 점인 것 같아요. 그래서 우리 한국 사회에서 아직 그냥 말하지 않아야 되는 거를 중립적이라고 생각하고 있는지 몰라서 제가 질문을 드렸습니다. 그래서 유럽에서는 어떻게 생각하시는지. 네, 정말 시간이 없어서 이제 2분이나 초과를 해서 여기서 마쳐야 될 것 같습니다. 아쉽지만 오늘 또 한마디 하실래요? 우리
저 한마디만.
아 그래요. 예.
네, 일단 아까 전에 이제 어떻게 해야 이제 학생들에게 정치적 중립성이 애초에 필요한가라는 도발적인 질문을 주셨는데, 저는 그렇게 생각을 해요. 애초에 아까 말씀하셨다시피 청소년들은 미숙합니다, 정치적으로. 물론 저 또한 마찬가지고, 그렇기 때문에 한마디로 말하면 청소년들은 백지 상태라고 볼 수 있어요. 그 백지 상태를 이제 갖고 나가는 건 이제 교육이 갖고 나갈 건데, 그 과정에서 이제 옆에 계신 교수님께서 말씀하셨다시피 어른들이 그 가치에 개입할 수 있는 여지가 충분히 있습니다. 그걸 충분히 이제 우리는 견제해야 할 텐데, 단지 학생들에게, 그러니까 저 나이 또래 친구